Okay. Well, the session this week is going to be on news values. And so we start with the question, what are news values and why do news values matter? The answer to that question should help to demystify journalism for you and make journalism more comprehensible for you. It should help you if you want a career in journalism, whether as a staff reporter or as a freelancer. The answer should help you increase your chances for employment, your chances to sell articles. If you don't want a career in journalism and your focus is to analyze journalism, the answers to these questions should give you the criteria to distinguish between good journalism and bad journalism. So, again, questions. What are news values in journalism, and why do news values matter in journalism? Let me start with a general definition. A general definition of news values would be that they are independent, dynamic categories and criteria that guide the selection of information and data, the selection of human sources to interview, the creation of questions to ask in an interview with sources, the structure of a story, the decision whether a story comes first or later in priority in a publication or a broadcast, and the choice of which stories have the highest to lowest priority relative to the specific audience in allocating resources and in publishing. That's a fairly long definition, and it's a generic definition, and it's going to need more definition and more precision as we get along. But that's a starting point. And let me throw out a few terms that are related that you would hear in the journalism or you hear in popular discussion. So one set of terms that we often hear and are actually a distinction of news values are the terms hard news and soft news. Hard news means information that has a serious impact on society. Soft news means information that can be interesting or emotional or as a curiosity, like a feature story, but the soft news does not have a serious impact on society. So, for example, a hard news story today might be the number of deaths today from the COVID pandemic. A soft news story today might be a story about a pet dog that had to travel 1,000 miles to find her way home to her family. The one story is hard news because of the degree of impact on society. The other is soft news because of virtually no impact on society. The dog story in news terminology in the newsroom is called a brightener, and that's a cute story or a funny story that lifts the mood of the audience and helps the mixture of stories. Some other terms that you hear in the newsroom or you hear in popular terms are yellow journalism and tabloid journalism. And as you'll see, those are also terms that have to do with news values. So, what are yellow journalism and what are tabloid journalism? Both of these terms are related to the issue of ethics and news values. Yellow journalism means journalism that is not based on hard news values. But yellow journalism creates revenue by attracting an audience with stories based not on facts, but stories based on speculation, exaggeration, exploitation, and sensationalism of emotional and lurid details. So, in that description of those values, in that term, yellow journalism, you see that those criteria are not ethical and not based on responsible news values. The term tabloid journalism is similar to yellow journalism. You also hear the term in the newsroom, a news feature. A news feature is a type of story that is more personal and more descriptive than a strict hard news story or breaking news story. But a news feature is also closer to news, hard news, than it is to a soft feature story. So a news feature, to give an example, might be a descriptive story about a particular person. In today's situation with the COVID pandemic, a news feature might be a story about an individual doctor who is saving lives during the COVID pandemic. So it's personal and descriptive, but it is connected to a news event of the pandemic that has a big impact on people. In that example of a news feature of a doctor dealing with patients with COVID, you would still give statistics in that story about the COVID pandemic, but structurally the story would begin with a couple of paragraphs about the doctor, then give a few paragraphs describing the hard news statistics in the wider context, and then the news feature would resume to the story of the doctor. Now, in this course, you're reading the biography of Marie Colvin, and in this context, Marie Colvin tends to write from a news feature angle, particularly because the ethos of Marie Colvin is she doesn't want abstract, impersonal statistics to dominate her stories, her journalism, over the connection with human people who are suffering. So typically, Marie Colvin does not file breaking news stories, and as you read the book, you'll even indicate she has some resistance to filing breaking news stories because she is so focused on an aspect of her news values, which give her sense of mission as a journalist, which give her sense of meaning to her life, and are partly why she feels fulfilled as a journalist. So Maria Colvin writes news features because she wants readers to connect emotionally with the people suffering during news events, and that also increases the effect of the story on readers. People react to people more than they react to cold, hard, abstract facts. So as I said, that captures, that sense of news values captures the mission of Marie Colvin. She wants readers of the newspaper she works for, the Sunday Times in Britain, she wants those readers to connect with strangers in a distant and foreign part of the world, a part of the world and people that her audience might not normally feel an interest to her. And so Maria Colvin's job and her approach to journalism fits a news feature story. Working for the Sunday Times, which publishes on Sundays, she typically files only stories for deadlines on to meet the Sunday issue, so she doesn't have to file stories every day. She has 6 days to meet the deadline for a Sunday newspaper. So that timing fits news features better and fits better the type of journalist Maria Colvin wants to be and the aspect of news values that she emphasizes. Now, a minute ago when I gave a generic definition of news features, I used a couple of terms, and I want to examine some of one of those terms. One word I used was independent. Okay? The independence of news values. What that means is that ideally, let me stress that, ideally, news values are related to verifiable facts and are independent of political parties and corporations. And of course, we're going to want to spend some time seeing how that plays out. But that's the ideal of independent journalism and independent news values. I use the word audience, very important word in journalism. Why? Well, basically, the audience is typically the source of revenue for paid journalism and the ultimate justification of the cost for journalism. So, in really simplistic terms, what that means is what interests the audience provides revenue, and what doesn't interest the audience doesn't provide revenue. For example, an audience in Canada might not be interested in a news story about the tax rate in Uganda. For that reason, demographics about an audience and readership metrics are very useful. What's the audience interested in? And as we'll ask later, what should the audience be interested in? Before the internet, the main metrics on readership were much cruder, and they were basically circulation figures and broadcast audience metrics from sample audiences. So in terms of broadcast media, a select group of viewers would have machines attached to their TV sets that would provide data on what shows the audience was watching and how many shows, and then you would extrapolate that and get an idea of the overall viewership of a story. That's before the internet. Now with the internet, the metrics are much more precise, and of course that those more precise metrics and that more precise feedback in journalism is going to have an effect on revenue and an effect on journalism. So with the internet, it's easy to collect metrics about viewing and readership. And you know that if you have, like me, you have your own YouTube channel. In that YouTube channel, you get metrics about what attracts an audience and what doesn't attract an audience, and how long the audience is watching your video. And those metrics give you feedback of how well your information is working in terms of engaging an audience. And in terms of news values, that would give you feedback on how your news values are working. Other terms, I talked about the allocation of resources in producing a story. The resources are the cost of producing a story in journalism in terms of the number of paid reporters and editors, how much paid time it takes the reporters and editors to cover a story, what the other costs in producing a story are, such as travel costs, equipment costs, maybe even legal fees. So, for example, a news outlet may not want to allocate in Canada the resources of sending a team of reporters to Uganda to investigate the tax rate there. There just wouldn't be an economic justification. That story is unlikely to interest the audience. And because it's unlikely to interest the audience, it's unlikely to produce revenue. And so that's the economic factor in journalism. I talked about in that general description of news values the choice of which stories have the highest to the lowest priority. So, for example, if we take an audience today in Kamloops, the tax rate in Kamloops is a hard news story that is likely to have higher priority than a bigger story in Halifax, because the audience is in Kamloops. So in Kamloops, we might have a story today about break-ins in cars, which is a very relatively minor criminal activity, but we might not have a story about the murder rate in Halifax, which is a bigger crime issue. The reason is that we are focused on a Kamloops audience. So that's the proximity factor. How close the news is geographically to the audience. I mentioned the structure of the story. A conventional style in journalism prioritizes the order of information in the story based on the degree of the news values. So the beginning of the hard news story summarizes the information with the most news values, and that introduction is called the lead or summary lead. The information with the highest news values comes first. The information with lower news values comes later, and that order, that structural order, is called the inverted pyramid style. You notice that in the general definition, I use the word dynamic about news values. That means that the emphasis within the categories of news values can shift depending on what is happening in the world. And the news values can vary from culture to culture, and the news values can vary from time to time. So I'll give you an example of that. Health issues are newsworthy because of the impact in society. But in 2019, a story about the potential for a world pandemic if a virus jumps from animals to human beings wouldn't be greeted with much excitement. And now that story dominates and it pushes out other newsworthy stories. Now that health issue is a hot economic and political issue. So in 2019, if you had a master's degree in health journalism, good luck trying to find a job in journalism. Maybe you would end up in the public relations department of a government health agency, which actually has happened to some of our journalism students. One of our journalism graduates from a few years ago went directly to work for the public relations department of this university, and from there she went to a public relations job with the Interior Health Agency in Kamloops. You noticed I also mentioned cultural context in news values. So that means that news values can change depending on culture. For example, there's a controversial story in the Philippines now about a young female flight attendant who died from a brain aneurysm. Very sad. But that story is getting large play in the Philippines because of strict conservative cultural values. This stewardess had the kind of liberated lifestyle typical of a Western woman, and many of her male colleagues were gay. So those cultural factors are giving that story more prominence for the audience, but you can see those factors have no relation to the death of this young woman by a brain aneurysm. So one of the questions I asked is, why do news values matter? That's going to take some while to examine, but let me make a start on that. One reason that news values matter is that because they affect costs and revenue. Also, because they can justify the necessity of journalism as ethical and responsible and important to society. Also, because they can affect your legal ability to publish or broadcast a story, and also because they can affect your chances of getting a job in journalism. So let's break that down a bit. Costs and revenue. That's easy to understand. As I've already said, basically, if a story attracts an audience, it generates revenue. Either the audience pays directly for the information, or advertisers pay the media for access to that audience. And so, in a sense, through the advertisers, the audience is still generating revenue. And if a story generates revenue, then journalists can get paid. The issue of importance to society. This is fairly easy to understand, but it's going to take more time to explain and break it down. But at this point, let me observe that the information that we're getting now on the internet is not filtered and produced according to professional news values. Except for what's on the internet in terms of reputable and responsible news outlets. So before the internet, what a Donald Trump would say would be filtered and put into context through publication that was handled by responsible professional journalists. Donald Trump before the internet would not have an easy direct access to a mass audience. He'd have to go through and be filtered by the professional media. Now that's changed. For the last 4 years, there's been no filter mechanism for Donald Trump on social media. And so Donald Trump, and Donald Trump, of course, we can observe, has no mental filter mechanism in himself. So he can reach an audience, mass audience, directly without having to go through the professional media. Now, we're seeing some changes happening about that even in the last few days as social media companies start to feel more pressure, and they're starting to warn against content, they're starting to censor content, and they're starting to block social media accounts like Donald Trump's Twitter account. Getting a job in journalism. How are news values related to that? Well, if the premise is true that the career of a journalist depends on the ability of the journalist to produce revenue, and if it's true that newsworthy stories produce revenue, then a journalist is more competitive for being able to produce newsworthy stories, and that journalist should have a better chance of being employed. So let's go back to Marie Colvin. We're reading her biography. Marie Colvin focused on a specific type of newsworthy story that defined the type of journalist she was. It defined the quality of her journalism, and it identified her employability. That isn't the only factor that explains the success of Marie Colvin, but it's an important factor. And there are other factors, and one you want to watch for when you're reading the biography is Marie Colvin's ability to network, to find sources, and to find support in her career. But you note that the rise of her career in journalism was very fast, and part of that had to do with her news values. What about your employability, either in getting a job as a staff reporter or working freelance? In both cases, news values are important. In responsible news outlets, you are judged by the quality of your news values. In your first reporting job, a factor will be the news factors in your clipping file and what you show about news values in your job interview. Entry-level positions in journalism tend to be for general assignment reporting, and general assignment reporting requires a range of skills, such as writing about politics, economics, crime and justice issues, and breaking news like fires and car crashes. So if you're applying for an entry-level position in journalism, and your clipping file is full of great descriptive feature stories about strawberry farms and online game reviews, you probably aren't competitive in that job situation. And for that reason, assignments in this course are focused on newsworthy stories that you could use in your clipping file to apply for an internship or to apply for entry-level position. What about if you're working freelance? Do you have more freedom as a freelancer? Can you dispense with news values as a freelancer? Well, as a freelancer, which is also, it can be a whole career as a freelancer, or it can be, freelancing can be a way to build up a clipping file to get a job. In freelance work, you're going to have to sell a story to a specific outlet, and it will depend, your ability to sell that story will depend on how your story fits the news values of the outlet. So, for example, in the last few years, as a faculty member producing journalism while I'm teaching, I've been interested in environmental issues, but environmental stories are hard to sell, particularly to large circulation magazines. So my strategy was to sell environmental stories to travel magazines. But travel magazines aren't going to be directly interested in environmental stories. What I did, the strategy was, I put the environmental issue inside the context of tourism. So I might write a story about ecotourism. And in that way, I would incorporate the news values of environment with the more feature-oriented travel magazine. Same way, I sold environmental stories to a philosophy magazine by putting the environmental issue inside the context of classical ethical philosophy. The philosophy magazine is not directly interested in news values of the environment, but it can be intrigued by how you examine an environmental issue in terms of classic ethics. Ultimate freelancing is writing books, because publishers don't have staff book writers. So a book author is essentially a freelance author. And when you're making a book proposal to a specific publishing house, as I do, you can only propose a book that fits what a specific book publisher wants to publish. So an example of that would be you don't propose an environmental book to a publisher that specializes in non-fiction crime books. And even a specific book publisher of non-fiction crime books will have specific ideas of what type of non-fiction crime books it wants and what type of book it doesn't want. If it's a magazine you're selling to as a freelancer, the advertisers may also be a factor in whether your story is accepted. For example, is a travel magazine going to accept an article about fraud in the travel business if the magazine relies on revenue from travel business, and this story might alienate publishers? Does that seem far-fetched to you? I worked for a daily newspaper which put out a weekend supplement on real estate, and one time on the front of this weekend real estate magazine put a story about how a review of a book about how to sell your home by yourself without a real estate agent. That story so outraged the advertisers, the real estate agents, that they pulled their advertising from the supplement, and they switched to a competing newspaper. So it does happen. What about photojournalism? News values also apply to photojournalism, and they apply to your photo portfolio. So if you note while you're reading the biography of Marie Colvin, you'll see towards the latter part of the book how she teams up with the photojournalist Paul Conroy because of how his photography complements her journalism, and they're both working for the same newspaper, the Sunday Times. So far, you may have noticed I haven't defined very clearly general categories of news values and their relationship to each other. But I'm proceeding, and eventually I'll get there. As my definition of news values get more precise, I'm going to want to add the limiting context of news values for conventional, ethical, responsible journalism. And to explain that, I'm going to make a distinction about the extremes of journalism, the extremes being purely to create revenue, and the type of journalism designed for the good of society. Now those are extremes. They're artificial extremes. Journalism is usually a balance between those two extremes across the spectrum. But in order to explain these factors more, I'm going to treat them as though they're different and those extreme examples. So some journalism generates revenue by reflecting the biases and prejudices of the audience, even if the information is dishonest and misleading. That is sometimes called tabloid journalism because that journalism is speculative, it's sensational, it's exaggerated, the stories are biased and mislead an audience in the way that the audience wants to be misled. So, for example, a story could speculate about the existence of aliens from outer space without having to prove that aliens from outer space exist. And it could even develop a conspiracy theory that the government knows aliens exist, but because the government is evil, the government is hiding the existence of aliens from outer space. And so that's maybe two biases that are confirmed, two biases in the audience, that the audience wants to be confirmed, that aliens exist and that the government is hiding the existence of aliens. And it's gratifying for the audience to read the story because it validates the audience. Now, right away you recognize that some politicians do the same thing, that politicians get votes by appealing to the biases and fears and anxieties of a group of voters that the voters want to be validated. Right away, the example of Donald Trump fits into that nicely. And so we look at Fox News and U.S. President Donald Trump, and those share, those two entities, Fox News and Donald Trump, they share a right-wing audience, and those two entities have a symbiotic relationship so that they can feed each other. So Fox News attracts a right-wing audience by echoing the right-wing views of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump gets some of his ideas from the right-wing stories of Fox News. So Donald Trump appealed to the right-wing bias of voters, and he rode that bias into power. This kind of extreme of journalism is an economic transaction. It's simply an economic transaction. So this kind of journalist might be motivated by salary and by increase in salary. It might be somebody like Tucker Carlson and Bill O'Reilly for Fox News, who make millions of dollars based on their ability to galvanize an audience. The other extreme to that is journalism designed for the good of society. Ideally, this journalism is ethical and responsible, and it would help support a democracy by providing independent, truthful information that is not afraid to contradict the beliefs of government, corporations, and the audience. Okay. As I explained, I'm recording this right now, so I would ask you to keep your microphone mute. So the other extreme.
I'll do the dishes later.
Okay, please mute your microphone because I'm recording this now. Okay. So the other extreme is journalism designed for the good of society. Ideally, I said this is the ethical, responsible journalism, and it supports a democracy by providing independent, truthful information that's not afraid to contradict the beliefs of government, corporations, and audience. The problem with this kind of journalism is that its ability to produce revenue may be reduced. And when the revenue is reduced, the ability to fund investigative journalism is reduced. And so this responsible journalism may be undermined by the loss of revenue in being responsible. And that's the dilemma in responsible journalism. Being responsible can reduce revenue and undermine the ability to produce responsible journalism. Now, this type of journalism, this extreme, has a sense of the importance of a public mission. And the public mission is built on news values. If a journalist gets satisfaction from the sense of mission in journalism, that person may get paid less, but the career have more value for that person because of the sense of mission. Now, if the sense of mission attracts an audience, that may bring in more revenue, and then the journalist gets paid more. So, you could look at salaries of journalists. A journalist, a really simple comparison, a journalist like Maria Colvin, who is doing important, responsible journalism, she is not going to get paid as much as Tucker Carlson with Fox News. Now, in some countries, the solution to that is the solution to that problem of the funding for responsible journalism. The solution is to fund that kind of journalism with public money or taxpayers' money. So in a country like Canada, the government funds with taxpayers' money the CBC, which is a broadcast media and also maintains websites. In Britain, the government funds BBC. At the same time, over the last few years, the British government has been reducing funding for the BBC. In American culture, Americans aren't as culturally as accepting of what they see as the socialism or even the communism of government funding funding certain things, including the media. So you don't really see the public government funding of the media in the United States that you see in Canada and Great Britain. So you see those two extremes in journalism. One that makes revenue by giving the audience what it wants, even if that information is confirmation of the audience's bias and prejudices. And the other extreme is journalism that reduces its ability to produce journalism and to fund good journalism by telling the public what it needs to know. And that's the dilemma. So where do news values come from? Well, news values are basically an abstract academic version of what is often based on intuition and experience in working journalists. So the terms of news values in a journalism course are likely to be more abstract than terms you hear used in a newsroom, although the ideas are similar. News values historically apparently were created by sociologists who were analyzing patterns in the media, beginning with a journal article, a scholarly journal article in 1964 by Norwegian sociologists. Other academic researchers picked up this idea and began to develop studies of journalism and analysis of news values. And in the next session on news values, I'm going to give you a specific list of news values that are based on my study of academic texts, looking for what is common and frequent terms in these journalism texts, based on what the best journalism texts say, such as the text for this course, which is a very good journalism text, and in chapter 1, which you've read, gets into news values. I gave you another reading posted on Moodle of a chapter for another journalism text which explores Moodle, which explores news values. So these are the news values are a refinement in terms and understanding of what emerges naturally in the newsroom from the experience of working journalists. And these news values also apply to photojournalism, although photojournalism adds newsworthy criteria that are visual and that we wouldn't have in written journalism. So in the biography of Marie Colvin, you see that towards the end she's working with the photojournalist Paul Conroy. They're working for the same newspaper, the Sunday Times. They travel together because they complement so well what each of them are doing. And as you'll see, Colvin quoted in the text, her sense is that the personalities of herself and Paul Conroy fit together because their sense of journalism is similar. And Marie Colvin is very specific about the type of photojournalists that she'll work with. My sense of news values begins with my career as a working journalist before I came to teach at this university. Comes from my working experience. And when I started to teach at this university, my old newspaper boss, editor Neil Reynolds, had moved to Vancouver to be the editor-in-chief of the Vancouver Sun. And one time I asked, can I come in to your newsroom for a day and observe from the inside, like attend editorial meetings, attend on in the front lines, and Reynolds said sure, and so then I was able to observe from the inside, which readers often don't get, the type of debates that typically go on behind the scenes, deciding how to allocate resources, deciding which story gets play and which story gets big play based on the news values. So from this you see how this examination of news values gives you an advantage in pursuing a career in journalism, whether freelance or staff writer. It gives you terminology to assess journalism. That is, how do we distinguish between good and bad journalism? And so I've already given you some terms based on news values and responsible journalism, how we could argue what is responsible journalism and what's irresponsible journalism, what type of story is justified and what type of story is not justified in the terms of ethics and justified in the terms of news values. You'll see how that now connects with reading the biography of Marie Colvin. You'll see you'll now have more terminology for examining and analyzing how Marie Colvin is motivated, how she sees herself as a journalist, what type of journalist she wants to be. Basically, she has that sense of mission in journalism of serving society through her specific news values, and her prominence as a journalist is related to her success with those news values. For assignments in this course, particularly the news story assignment, that assignment depends on your ability to understand news values that, like I said, are useful in a career, are useful in developing an analytical ability to distinguish between good journalism and bad journalism. Your first stage in your news story assignment is the proposal, which is due on February 5, and in that proposal you want to define very clearly what the news values are in your story and your angle to your story, and with that kind of focus in news values, in defining that aspect and proposing that aspect of the story, that leads you to which type of data you need to collect and what type of sources you need to interview. Now, the assignment is broken down into 3 stages: the proposal, the progress report on your interviewing, and the final assignment, rather than just one large assignment. And so by breaking it down into 3 stages, that helps you plan your story, but it also gives you feedback from me on how your assignment is progressing. And from that, if I feel that you're veering away from the news values, I can give you feedback to help you put your assignment back on track. As well, in this course and all my courses, I have office hours, and so that allows you to book an appointment with me to discuss an assignment before you've handed in your assignment. Now, let me just finish by saying that now I think you have an idea how news values fit into an introductory course in journalism like this, and you'll see how news values fit into any journalism course you take. So if you're taking one of our 2 news writing courses, you understand that news values have an important relationship to news writing, how you write the story. If you're taking our research methods course, you understand that news values are related to research, what you research and what you don't research. If you're looking at interviewing techniques, then you understand how news values are related to interviewing technique. If you're taking our media theory and history course, which I've taught in the past, you'll see how news values can fit into media theory. And if you're taking our photojournalism courses, and I have taught our photojournalism courses, and I have a working background as a photojournalist, you'll see how news values also affect photojournalism.